being here. Thank you for being here. Hello to everybody and welcome to our second online seminar of Open Science. First of all, we thank the Italian Association of Psychology for the opportunity to organize our online seminars, and we give our welcome to our guests, our speakers, that is Eiko Fried. Just give you a little introduction. He's obtained his PhD in clinical psychology at the Free University of Berlin, followed by 4 years of postdoctoral training in methodology. He now works as associate professor in clinical psychology at Leiden University. Eiko's research takes place at the intersection of clinical psychology, psychiatry, and complexity science, and his interests are how to best measure, predict, and understand mental health problems. His lab is currently focused on developing a personalized early warning system for depression. So we gave our warm welcome to our guest, and dear Heiko, the stage is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. I hope everybody can see my slides. I made a new talk for you guys today. I'm actually not quite sure how long it'll take. I know I have about 45 minutes. I hope it'll be quicker so we can have discussions. Feel free to podcast this or turn your camera off, but of course, if you want to keep the camera on, it's always nicer to talk to faces rather than talk to a wall of little dots on the screen. And feel free to interrupt. I'm not going to be able to monitor chat too well, so maybe Michaela, you can help me with this. But if there are any questions, clarification things, me talking about the stuff we do is very boring for me. Getting questions and being able to engage with the content is actually a learning experience. So, anything, feedback, criticism, whatever, welcome. So there's going to be 2 parts today. In the first part, I will talk about a paper that Jessica Flake and I wrote on questionable measurement practices. And I'll summarize this briefly. It's a tutorial paper. I recommend you all read it if you're interested in the topic of how we can improve the transparency of measurement in the sort of open scholarship reform. And the second part is sort of an extension of that, where I worked with my colleague Zachary Cohen on measurement restrictions and how transparency is important to sort of, improving our science. I'm a psychologist. I'm not sure how many people here are in psychology or social science, but these are my examples for today because they're relevant to our field, and I'd be happy to learn more about your fields. And because it was just Halloween, and because measurement issues terrify me, I made sort of a Halloween talk. A scary Halloween talk, because the things I see every day in this literature are very scary for me. So it's going to be Halloween themed. Okay. This is the Mars rover that I think in 1999 was sent into space, and then it was in space over 300 days, traveling all by itself, and it was cold and dark for this little satellite. And it made it all the way into Mars, and then it crashed into Mars' atmosphere and was destroyed during the process. The reason for this is that the Europeans, who were part of the programming team, programmed in metric units, and the Americans, who were part of the other programming team, programmed in imperial units. And all of a sudden, feet became meter, and meter became inches, and then, the program didn't work. And I'm saying this to say that measurement issues are really difficult, even in physics and astronomy and engineering, where we work with somewhat more objective criteria than internal states like personality or intelligence or depression. This is a bridge that Germans and Swiss built across the Rhine. And when you build a bridge across national borders, both countries built the bridge from both sides simultaneously. And once they had built 80% of the bridge, the engineers on the Swiss side noticed that the bridge wouldn't go together at the same height level. One side was higher than the other. The reason for this is that there's 2 definitions of height above sea level. One is in Geneva, the other is in Amsterdam. they're slightly different. The Germans use Amsterdam and the Swiss use Geneva. And so I think there was like a 56 centimeter difference, and they had to build the bridge again because 56 centimeters is nothing you can just fix a little bit on the side. Now we come to the social sciences where I work, where I think measurement is even harder. When I ask, say, 200 students, I give them a survey and I say, please answer the following question: yes, uncertain, or no. Most people will say yes. I'm not asking them a question. I'm not saying, do you like ice cream or how tall are you? I just say, just click the one of these three options that vibes most with you. Most people will say yes. If you ask them, if they ask them, please fill in the following question, very satisfied, satisfied, and so forth, most people will answer satisfied. But again, we're not asking you how satisfied are you right now. We're not asking any prompt. And still, people aggregate around satisfied. Same for correct false. If you ask people no question, instead you only say, please decide correct or false, more people will say correct. Oops. This has been replicated across many studies, across many decades. So this is a consistent pattern. People have a clear response pattern in answering to this, and we don't really know why. This is a great paper by Andy Mall in my field, who asked people a number of questions about gavagai. Now, gavagai is not a word in any language. And he chose that word specifically because it is not a word in any language. So, for example, one question is, you have a certain amount of gavagai and you can't really do much to change it. Yes, no. Your gavagai is something about that you can change very much. Yes, no, and so forth. And the factor structure of this questionnaire was perfect. There was a one-item factor solution. All the psychometric properties in psychology told us that this is a great scale. It works really well. The statistics look really great, but of course the questionnaire is nonsense. It makes no sense. Why is that? So this is just to say that measurement is very difficult in physics and in engineering, but especially I think in our sciences where we're trying to measure internal states. And then there's a little piece that I wrote with Jessica Flake. Measurement obviously matters. I don't think I need to convince you that measurement is the foundation of science in any science. And if we're not measuring something adequately, well, how are we going to build theories based on or why are we even talking about analysis? In the machine learning literature, they say garbage in, garbage out, right? Your measurement needs to be reasonable to do anything with your data, no matter what your data are. Now, I'm the co-founder of the open science community in Leiden, and I'm very involved in the topic. It's very dear to my heart. I'm going to say open science a lot today because it's shorter, but I think we should talk about open scholarship, really, including teaching and other aspects, but okay. And transparency about analyses and pre-registration and data sharing is discussed a lot. But when Jessica and I wrote this paper, transparency around measurement was not discussed at all. And so that is the gap we tried to fill with our questionable measurement practices paper. The paper was called Measurement Schmeasurement, sort of an American way of highlighting that something isn't taken very seriously. It started on Twitter half a decade ago, and there you can see a photograph of me and Jessica trying to measure something. So sort of like an advertisement for a workshop we taught. And I think it's a really nice paper. I recommend reading it. It's short and it's a very applied paper for folks who don't have like a validity theory background or are not deeply entrenched in measurement. And in the second part of the paper, we provide sort of a guideline for things to think about. In the first part of the paper that I will largely skip today, we show that there's many problems in measurement transparency. And so the questions we have for you are, what is your construct? Because we think that to evaluate if a measure performs well, you need to define very clearly what you ought to measure so we can see if your measurement tool measures what you ought to measure. But that's very rarely the case in my field. From social psychology to cognitive psychology to clinical psychology, the constructs are very rarely properly defined. Why did you select your measure and how did you select your measure? I've written a lot about depression measurement. At the moment, over 30 different instruments are used to measure depression, the same construct. And it's very unclear why people use some measures and other people use other measures and so forth. How did you quantify your measurement, for example, right? You can do a sum score, you can have subscales, you can have factor scores, and there's lots of questionable stuff happening there where people try this in all sorts of different ways sometimes and then report only one way because it aligns with what they want to show. Modification, scale modification is a big problem. Jessica Flake calls them on-the-fly scales, or existing scales that are modified. So it's good to distinguish between existing scales that are modified or scales that are created on the fly. And there's lots of literature in emotions, for example, showing that a lot of scales, like one-item scales, are created on the fly. There's never really any validation. They're never being used again. And then I think we have to wonder what we measure with this from the get-go. Okay, this is just, I'm going to give you just a few egregious examples, or what I think to be problematic examples in the literature to show that this matters. This is just one of many examples where the scale used here, the SPSS, is usually one single scale. And I don't know, I didn't reanalyze the data, but my understanding or my speculation here would be that the authors didn't find any significant effect, whatever they were looking for, using the full scale. And then they disaggregated their scale into a positive part of the scale and a negative part of the scale. And then all of a sudden they did find a group difference, but only regarding the positive part of the scale. If this is true or not doesn't really matter. Take it as I also don't know the authors. I'm not an SSPS scholar myself, but this happens all the time. And some of this is clearly questionable. And I would like you to think before you do your study, clearly how you will utilize and operationalize your measurement instruments. And if you write an exploratory paper, feel free, and go ahead and do whatever you want. But if you're writing a confirmatory paper and you want to confirm a hypothesis, I don't think you should split your scale up or remove items and so forth. And we see this all the time happening, of course, right? So this is a garden of forking paths. I'm sure, given that you're interested in this event, many of you will know what this means. Just one example here, and the authors on the left side aren't doing that here necessarily, but this happens all the time, obviously, where you have a scale and you don't find a significant effect, but you have this hypothesis you need to be confirmed because it's your theory. And so you start removing items. And there's many ways to remove items. It's not significant. Then you just can take a second scale. In depression measurement, it's very common that people use 2 or 3 or 4 scales and only report the one that is significant, unfortunately, right? But this also isn't significant. Now I can do a principal components analysis rather than having a sum score for my scale. Also not significant. I can use subscales or combine them. I can break my scales apart, and eventually I'll find a significant difference on whatever I'm looking for. And of course, that's problematic. In the paper, and this is something Jessica Flake has highlighted for a lot of her work, in the social sciences, we've had this reproducibility crisis, and we've talked about replications, and a lot of the focus has been on statistical practices. Are our studies underpowered? Are people p-hacking? Do we have pre-registered our analytic pipeline? Have people shared code? But we're very rarely talking about these issues regarding measurement. Right? So this is sort of the gap that we try to fill here. And even if you pre-register your methods, that doesn't help me at all if you don't pre-register your measurements, because you still have so many degrees of freedom left to explore. And again, I don't think every paper needs to be registered personally, pre-registered personally. I think there's good exploratory work you can do without that. But if you have confirmatory hypothesis testing work and you do a pre-registration, please also pre-register your measurements very clearly. Okay, there's measure hacking. Most of you know what outcome switching is, perhaps. Sorry, there's lots of information on the slide to make this easy for you. There has been many studies showing that in clinical trials, where you're trying to find that a certain drug works on a certain treatment for mental health, for example, depression, outcome switching happens. Outcome switching means authors pre-register or register a primary outcome for their clinical trial, which is mandatory by law. And then later in the paper, they just all of a sudden analyze a different outcome, not the registered one, which obviously, likely has the reason that the original one didn't obtain significant results. And then there's lots of work on pharmaceutical funding in this area. And if a study is funded by a pharmaceutical company compared to those that are not, the odds ratio is about 1.5 that the outcome will change. So the probability is considerably higher for studies with pharma funding compared to those without pharma funding that the outcome will switch or change. And the odds ratio is nearly 2 for the same question for the date after completion rate. So there are also potential covariates that explain why outcome switching is taking place, and pharma funding is one of these that has a strong impact on whether outcome switching will take place. Skip this here. This is a master's thesis one of my students wrote, which I think is a really cool work. So what we did here is we selected 100 random papers from 4 prestigious journals that use the Hamilton rating scale for depression. It's a very common rating scale for depression in my field. And then Linus simply counted what percentage of these papers that are published in high impact journals did a few things. First, we looked at how many of them define depression properly. And only 26%, so yes is always green, 22, red is no, and then yellow is sort of a little ambiguous. And only about a fourth of the papers clearly define depression. And so for the others, I would argue we're not sure if the Hamilton scale measures depression because depression wasn't properly defined. Only, I think, 8% of the papers explained to the reader why they chose to measure depression using the Hamilton scale and not the Beck scale or the CESD or the Zung or any of the other 30 scales that are being used out there. Then about 40% of the papers didn't tell us what version of the Hamilton scale they used. And so for you as non-Hamilton experts, it's good to know that the Hamilton scale exists as 6-item version and 11 and 14 and 17 and 20, 24 and 27-item versions, and has been translated to over 50 languages. So there's a couple of thousand versions of the Hamilton scale, and only 60% of authors reported what type of scale they used. And then validity evidence was absent from most papers. And with that, I mean sort of reliability, validity, sort of psychometric evidence. Okay, this is the first part. This is the measurement part. I hope that's clear just to set up this talk a little in this aspect. Are there any comments, thoughts, questions, any pushback? This is not a bad time to hold in for a second and see if anybody has something to contribute. If anything was unclear, I'm happy to explain again. Or maybe you guys are just too scared of all the measurement stuff happening.
Could be.
Okay, and I'll continue. All right. Okay. Now I want to talk about measure restrictions, which we don't talked about very much in the questionable measurement practices paper. But I'm working on this with Zai Cohen at the moment, and I think this is an important topic for all of us to consider as well, and not just a topic in the social sciences. Some of the examples here are from medical sciences, and yeah, I think it's good to talk about. So gold standard, sorry, I'm trying to move the Zoom window. Gold standard measures in my field, but also medicine, often come with some form of copyright. Many of you will have encountered this when you run your own empirical studies. You sort of need to pay the library to, I don't know, obtain the scale, or you need to pay for every participant that you run using a scale. And in the upcoming paper that we have that has a current working title between Zach and I that I can't say on camera because it's being recorded, but it's we're very unhappy about the situation, so we use very harsh language internally at the moment. We talk about 3 restrictions on obtaining and using measures. The first is the requirement to obtain permission for scale use, which in principle seems okay, but there are many obstacles here. The second is the requirement to keep the scale content secret or confidential, which is an outright violation of academic principles, I think. Right? If I measure something, the reader in my paper would likely want to know how I measured it, and I think I should be able to tell the reader. But it is literally illegal in some cases if American copyright rules are applied to measures, which is legal in the US to apply these measures. And then, of course, there are often requirements to pay for scales, and I'm going to talk about some of the problems that result from this, including some ethical considerations. And I'm going to call out some authors in particular, not because I have beef with them, but because I need examples. Otherwise, these things don't ever come across. I want to highlight that what these authors do is, in my understanding, legal under American copyright law. So I'm not saying you're breaking the law or something, but I'm raising ethical challenges, and I'm raising challenges that I see need to be fixed by us before we can move on to do proper science in this area. So hope we'll see if you agree with me or not. So many of these are my own experiences. I should add that I'm 41 now. I'm associate professor. I have a career in reanalyzing existing data, and only in the last 3 years have I collected like a large-scale data set myself using smartphone data, smartwatch data, sort of time series data in 2,000 people into languages. And so I had to build my own measurement battery for the first time, like from ground up. And because I've worked on this topic, I wanted open questionnaires and I wanted validated questionnaires and so forth. And so some of these are my own experiences with this. So there's the work and social adjustment scale, which is the most commonly used scale to measure how much people are impaired in their daily life. Can you go to work? Can you maintain sexual relationships? Can you do groceries? These sort of questions. And in the paper that introduces this scale from the 90s, the authors did something really cool, which was unusual in the 90s. They said, you can use the scale for free as an academic after obtaining permission. That's awesome. Now, the first point here is that this is at the very end of the paper and easy to miss. But let's assume, you want to acquire, like Michaela is working on this and she wants to know if she needs to acquire permission. You might easily miss this, of course, right? And your colleagues might not know. So this is not a great way to do this today. But assume you find this and you try to contact Dr. Marks. Well, there's no email address here, right? So will you write a letter? We tried. And this is the address today. This is the Minaret Community Center, which is probably not the right address anymore to reach Dr. Marks. And so I asked on Twitter, and somebody had Dr. Marks' personal email address, who is, I think, 94 at this point. And I think within 5 minutes, he responded and said, oh, I give you permission to use the scale. Like, so in the end, it's a really cool, positive story to some degree, but this can't be how we do science, obviously. And kudos to Dr. Marks here. Great that he did respond quickly. And yeah, but this is not sustainable, obviously, right? And what happens in 5 years if he may no longer be around? Fingers crossed this doesn't happen. But people do die at some point. What happens with copyright then? Does it go to his family? Do I need to Google his family members and obtain permission from them? How does it work? And if you're at an under-resourced university that doesn't have a legal department, how do you gain information? Like, do we need to be copyright scholars now to figure out if I can use a scale in my study? I don't have the time for that. This happens all the time, by the way. Many clinical scales, like the Hamilton scale I mentioned before, are from the 1960s. So the authors are in most cases dead at this point. So there's no central data bank to figure out permissions. And for my study, where we had about 700 items in the end for the battery, we found information including on scientific publications, often behind paywalls, so I would need to pay to see if I need permission, on personal author websites, on university websites, and on websites of scale publishers, commercial publishers. This is not sustainable, right? If you have 50 or 100 scales you want to use, it'll take you months to figure out the copyright. Also, you can't rely on the information you find. So if you don't find information that a scale is free, it doesn't mean it's for free. And if you do find information that a scale is free, it doesn't mean it's for free either. For example, this paper here says that the scale is available for free use, but it isn't. The author of the scale told me this is wrong. How do we solve this? This is not a trivial issue to solve, right? I talked about copyright holder dying already. And what about translations? In our study, or short versions, what about adapted versions? In our study, there's a 20-item version that has copyright, and I was told I cannot use it without paying. But other authors developed a 6-item version of these 20 items, a short version, and told, which is a subset of the 20 items, and said it is free of use. I can use these 6 items. Do I need a law? Like, can I? And what happens if I do this and I get in legal trouble? Will university defend me? We all work with in my field with measurement batteries. You can't do this without. So this doesn't work. This is not sustainable. Now, my favorite scale, the 3-item mini spin. Second topic now, talking about protected scale content. So I was wanting to use a 3-item questionnaire. I would love to show you the content, but I had to hide it because I'm not allowed to tell you what the content of these 3 items is. These items query a mental health problem, like an anxiety problem, something like, I don't know, I get nervous when I talk to people. That sort of questionnaire we're talking about. We're not talking about sort of a chemistry patent where somebody developed a procedure to, this is not rocket science. This is just a question or 3 questions. So the mini spin has 3 items, and I reached out to the author and said, it's 3 items, it's short, I'd like to use it. And the author said, here is an agreement, a Word file agreement that you need to sign. You need to pay for this, but I'm going to get to this in a second. It also said, I need to agree in writing with my signature that in any publication resulting, I don't publish or partially reproduce the scale content, and it should not appear in any form where it is accessible to the public. So it's sort of a gag thing where I can tell readers what kind of items I used. And I really think that's a very big problem in terms of scientific openness and replicability and reproducibility, and also contrast with some practices of my own funders. I have an ERC grant, and the ERC wants me to put my measures online, of course, for reusability. But again, this is completely legal. I'm not calling out the author here for doing something illegal. He has absolutely the right to put a copyright on his measure and ask for money for it. Totally okay. I just struggle with it and the implications for our field. Further, the author wanted me to pay $800 for these 3 items in my 2,000 participants. To tell you what that means, our 90-minute online survey would cost $250,000 if I paid $800 every 3 items, because we have a couple of 100 items in there. So, $800 to you might not sound like much, but if everybody did this, we couldn't do any research anymore. And again, these are not specifically developed amazing nuclear technology things. These are questions somebody came up with about anxiety. Okay. Let me check the time quickly. Okay, I'm early, but I hope that leaves some time for discussions. There are consequences from these 3 things. If you don't acquire permission for use, for me, for example, the Minaret Center, Dr. Marks agreed, and he probably wouldn't have sued me if I had used this measure without, but it happens. So if I don't acquire permission, if I do share the scale content, but I'm not allowed to share the scale content, or if I use a scale without paying fees, there are consequences. And these are not made up. These are all things that have happened. First consequence, expulsion from graduate schools. So people are dropped from US graduate schools for copyright infringement because the university doesn't want to deal with a legal battle. Many people have received fees of several $1,000s for infringing copyright, and it has led to multiple retracted publications because the author said, I can't pay that. And so the consequence was you need to retract your scientific paper. And again, we're not even talking about people who may have known that there was copyright on a scale because it is so hard to know, or people who did this on purpose, who had information that you have to pay for these scales. Because you can find, if you Google a scale in PDF, you'll find it on the internet, right? You might not be aware that there's something. People might have not read the footnote or Googled the author website or something like this. But it can mean that your paper is going to be retracted, which is ludicrous, I think. Here's a fantastic write-up. So if you're more interested in this, is a 2017, I think it's a Nature or Science journalism piece on a very particular questionnaire. The questionnaires, I have the link down here. I'm happy to send it later also, or reach out to me. I'm going to send it to you, pay or retract. The MMAS8 about treatment adherence. And again, we're not talking about a biochemistry company who developed some sort of patent over 10 years using rocket science. Items about treatment adherence are items such as, do you sometimes forget to take medications? Do you always take your medications? The questions about treatment adherence. The authors of the scale, I think there are two authors, have, quote from this piece, demanded payments as much as tens of thousands of dollars each from hundreds of researchers. Imagine making millions of euros from a 10-item treatment adherence scale. And there have been several retractions when researchers could not pay or were not willing to pay that sort of money. So I recommend that piece. I think it's very insightful. And that leads me to the last part, the ethical considerations. Restrictions such as those I can manage. I'm a white male professor at a Dutch university. I have research assistants I can put on this. I have the time to spare, and I could even get legal advice from my university if I really wanted to. But obviously, restrictions like those disproportionately affect under-resourced clinicians in my area and under-resourced researchers who are probably in the global south and not in the Netherlands primarily. And that's, of course, a problem. If we take open scholarship seriously, it is an issue of diversity and inclusion. Everybody in the world, every researcher in the world, no matter how rich their university is, should be able to participate in the scientific discourse, should be able to read our papers, and should be able to use measurement tools. And obviously, some of the fanciest journals, they want you to use certain measures because they're gold standard. And so if an under-resourced clinician from the global south were to use a different scale because they can't afford that scale, they're not going to publish their paper in Nature or Science because they don't use the gold standard instrument, right? So I think these are really big problems. And to mention the mini spin here, legally, again, this is fine legally, these authors are making, or some of these authors are making a lot of money, despite the development of the scale having been funded publicly by taxpayer money. So in this case, the mini spin was funded by the National Institute of Mental Health in this research paper where they introduced the scale, but it is then marketed for your own good, so to speak. I think that's a problem, ethically speaking. And for the MMAS paper, for example, the treatment adherence paper I mentioned before, there was recently a paper on a Korean version of that scale, which is cool. I think obviously scales should be validated and translated. But that paper includes as an author the person who makes money with the scale, who has sued, dozens or hundreds of researchers. And the authors don't declare any conflict of interest in the paper. I think that's problematic because if the psychometrics of the scale look good in the Korean version, the authors are more likely to gain money from selling that scale on the Korean market. So I think it's unethical to not declare conflicts of interest in this case, if there's money to be made with measurement. Okay, now you know why this is a measurement talk on Halloween horror stories. Really bothers me. Thanks for listening to me ranting about this, and I'm curious. Feedback, whatever you have. Thanks. And I'd also be curious if this looks differently in your field, by the way. Like I know a little bit about social and medical science or biomedical sciences, but if this is solved in your area, I'd love to hear how this is solved in your area and so forth.
Thank you very much. So If there are some comments, questions, please raise the hand or write on the chat. I will give you the stage. We basically give the priority to PhD students for a while. Okay, so let's begin with Christina.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I think you can hear me, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you. It was really a very interesting and scary presentation. I work in social commission, so I never had this kind of problem. But I have a kind of naive question, which is, okay, given this situation, shouldn't we just avoid using this scale from an ethical point of view, avoid using them completely and develop other scales that are free for everybody? And also by avoiding using them, decreasing the importance of these scales that are so heavily, so hugely paywalled.
Yeah, fully agreed. That's indeed a pretty easy solution. But for that to be the solution to the problem, people need to be more aware of the problem. Because, you know, medical professors in Harvard or elsewhere who have paid for these scales all their life, who have only used the scale, who have an agreement or even know the publisher or something, they're not going to change their practices because they don't have a perceived problem. For them, you know, 1,000 euros per study for them is just out of pocket money. And it's always been like that. So they're probably not fully understanding the issue that other researchers face here. And that's why we want to write this paper. I agree. And there are efforts here, for example, in my field in depression research, the NIH and the Wellcome Trust are trying to mandate the use of a open and free scale, the PHQ. I think that's also problematic, but at least they chose a free scale and on purpose, because if we measure depression with one scale, it should definitely be a free scale. And in my own study, I ended up not paying for a single scale either for the same purpose. I wanted to share all my things online. I'm not funded by the European Union to pay for measures. I'm funded to find out something about depression. So I also don't think I should pay from the money in my project. I'd rather hire a graduate student from that money. And so I agree with your solution, but the paper that we're writing on this is more, you know, trying to make sure the problem is well understood by everyone out there. And I don't think that's the case at the moment in my field.
So Marco Tullio.
Hi, Eiko. It was very nice to hearing from you, and I agree with I found the presentation very important, and I myself stumbled upon some of similar issues in the past. I had to retract the preprint for similar reasons because there was written in a footnote that the translation was not allowed without paying, and we didn't notice that, so we thought it was fine to translate it into Italian and validate it into Italian. But at least in that case, the authors were very reasonable, and we finally found an agreement for using those items with their agreement. But it is not always the case, and I can see that this issue, along also with the partly are related, but is another issue that I think that has some potential threats to the open science movement is the GDPR, and how that can hamper sometimes the data sharing. So I think material sharing and data sharing can, but at least for the GDPR, I think that the reason the interest that law is protecting, it's more valuable than in this case. But I think this could potentially be two potential threats. And I wanted to ask if a bit in line with Christina's question, if there is any ongoing open psychometrics project that tries to collect all the possible measures that are free to use and also that are fairly well validated, because one of the problems is that sometimes these proprietary measures have or should have at least good psychometric properties, whereas maybe there are free alternatives, not that much. So if I wanted to know if there is some ongoing project to deliver a useful tool for scholars who want to use open psychometrics measures.
Yeah, thanks. Fantastic questions. I'm sorry for your experience, and I'm glad the authors were reasonable in your case. They were also in my case. The mini-spin author, for example, was very nice per email and said, you know, I can bump down the price a little bit for you given your funding. But of course, that doesn't solve the problem, you know, inherently. But I'm not going to pin this on this one author or this one author team, of course, right? They're doing things that are very normal in you know, in the system. So, you know, open psychometrics. I'm at SIPS most every year, which is a conference on open science and psychology. And there's usually a workshop or two or hackathon on measurement. And this topic comes up every year at SIPS. This year it was in Padua, I think, in Italy, actually. Maybe some of you were there. The problem is that there's just 10 billion measures in psychology. Just for emotions, there's like thousands of measures. So doing this in any consortium will require a large interdisciplinary consortium, and funders aren't happy to fund measurement work. It's not sexy enough, sadly enough. So I'm not aware of a global initiative, but we could do this bottom up. My poor graduate students in my warn-D project, where we're building this early warning system for depression, have worked for 2.5 years together with many RAs and bachelor students and master students to develop our battery and to write code books for the battery, because we used, you know, with 900 items and I don't know, hundreds of scales, we adapted some of these scales, and we wanted to say exactly how we adapted each item, why we adapted each item. You know, when they talked about fax machines, we talk about computers. When they talked about newspapers, we talked about online websites, like these sort of adaptations. And so after 2.5 years, we're now done. So we have online, as part of our protocol paper, a open psychometrics questionnaire that we used, and we encourage everybody to reuse this if they're interested in depression, risk, and resilience. It's based on a Delphi study. You know, like there's so much work that goes into just one study. But that's why I highlight to my students how important it is to share that questionnaire with the community, including a clear code book, to make sure, you know, cumulative psychological science happens. For larger initiatives, I think we need topical initiatives. We need one on emotion and one on depression and one on, you know, other things. But it'll take decades, I think. It's so much work. We would need a lot of people and funding to get this going. So if you ever see a call for measurement work, feel free to reach out to me. I'd be super happy to help putting in a grant or getting this organized within one field to start with, on one topic to start with. Sorry, long answer, but I've been thinking about this a lot over the last decade.
Okay, are there any other questions, comments, suggestions? Okay, so I think that we can close our seminar. Thank you again, Eiko. Thank you very much. And we want to remind you that there will be available the certification of your attendance. If you want it, please send us an email. And also only those who requested in the subscription will receive the certificate. There is also the next seminar on the 17th January 2024, in which we will have a practical activity with the hands-on on pre-registration. So for all the PhD students, please spread the voice. If you want to have some practical experience on how to begin a pre-registration, be there, and we will do all together. And also the video will be uploaded on the YouTube, and you will receive, as usual, an email. So thank you again to everybody, and see you soon. And Merry Christmas.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.